Affairs. We thank you also for all that has gone into this program, including traveling mercies. We are asking you to begin with us and to continue with us and to help us learn from it, and at the end of it all, take us back home to our various destinations. Be with the speakers, let there be clarity of mind and thought, and let us in unison, Father, herald this program to the glory of your holy name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Although we all know why we are here, I would like to invite Professor Isaac Osakoto, the head of the Economics Division at ISSER, to give us a welcome remarks.
Anama, I thought you were going to do this one. Good morning, all. Good morning, Director. This is, I think, the event just before the main budget sort of event in November. Next month, we'll have another event on the debt issues, somewhere in September. This one is about the mid-year budget that was presented somewhere last week. You know, there are a lot of stories, not only in Ghana, but globally, a lot of stories on the economies of advanced countries, economies of emerging markets, the economies of development countries. If you read all of them, they center around the post-COVID and then the global sort of conflict, the post-COVID event. And quite a lot of the discussions, they are about recovery, right? How fast are we going back to the pre-pandemic levels? And how fast we are getting there. Some countries, they have been able to sort of slowly gone back to the pre-pandemic levels. What about the situation for developing countries? How fast are we moving towards the pre-pandemic levels? Do we even see the Jamestown, that light, what is it? The lighthouse. You see, if you are a navigator and you are coming far away from Côte d'Ivoire and you don't seem to see that lighthouse, you get confused. But if you see that lighthouse, then you know that this is my path. Then maybe you want to go straight, or you want to do a quick turn and use a shorter route or something like that. And if the engine you are traveling with is not that strong, you may want to go slowly instead of moving so fast. So all the discussions about recovery to pre-pandemic levels is about that. Are we on course to recovery? How far are we from where we are to the pre-pandemic situation? And how fast are we there? So most of the discussions that we'll have today with respect to the Ghanaian situation will be about that, right? What our indicators are telling us. Are we far away from it? Have we even seen the lighthouse? And are we on the course, or we have turned some way? We'll have sort of an overview, a quick overview for the first half of the year, and then we compare that to what we had last year, and then sometimes compare that to the pre-pandemic conditions. We'll also look at the macroeconomic situation, and then sectorial development. Most of those presentations, in fact, not all, will be done by the director of the institute, Professor Peter Korte. So mine is just to tell you what we're going to do, and also to thank you very much for coming to listen to us. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sakutu. Next will be to listen to Professor Peter Korte, the director of ISSER, for him to let us know whether we have turned the corner, as some have asked, and as Prof. Sakutu also said, whether we've seen the lighthouse, whether we are on course or we are off course, and Prof. Peter Korte will do his best to set us on the right path. So just have your questions ready for him, and then hopefully by the time we leave here, we will all know exactly where we are and see where we hope to be in the future. Thank you. Please welcome Prof. Peter Korte.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Oh, are you not happy to be here? I said good morning. Good morning. Yeah, thank you. I thought I had upset you or something. So, yes, normally we do this with the media in focus, but also people we think are very, very much interested in the Ghanaian economy are invited here. So it's not a large crowd, but this is a specialized kind of event that we hold to look at the media budget review. And you also notice that we are not very quick to come out because we like to digest the report and make sure we present an informed opinion. We don't want to be like political commentators where we rush out there to speak. So bear with us if we seem to be a bit late, but that is basically what we do. So I would present to you the media review, assessment of the media review. If I can have, who is projecting? Yes, well, I think, yes, you reminded me. I have yeah, okay. So, basically, a review of the media 2023 budget. We have the following persons who have all contributed in one way or the other to help this happen. So, on the list, Professor Fosu, myself, Professor Sakutu, Utama Feni, Dr. Fred Janku, Andrew Holmes, Richard Atankuma, Rafama, Nanama Santipoku, who just spoke, Gloria Formensa, and then Ebutexin Oseda Charles Chasaka is also here in this room. So when we finish and you have questions, you've seen the names that we have here. They will answer the questions for us. I deliberately presented the names here. Okay, so the outline Professor Sakutu has given that outline. So I'll move straight to look at one of the issues in the global economy. We know globally there's been growth slowdown from 3.6 in 2022 to about 3% in 2023. And it's projected to remain at 3.0 up to 2024. In terms of commodity prices, it has begun there's a decline, but rapid decline in trade volumes as well is recorded. We've also seen world inflation increase from 4.7 in 2021 to 8.7 in 2022, but it's expected to decline to 6.8 in 2023. Some recovery is being expected, or we are witnessing some recovery in terms of COVID. Now we see many things happening. Life are back to normal. Airlines are moving, people are traveling, there's economic activity. We are not using masks, we are not being restricted in one way or the other. So globally, a few positive things are happening, although inflation continues to be a challenge. So we're seeing how the value added in services sector distance to pre-pandemic trends are showing that there's significant recovery, showing the sort of resilience that is driven by the services sector especially, and also in our case, agriculture. Now, with a mid-year budget, we've seen that for the first quarter, we saw a 3.1% growth in GDP, that is a real GDP, and then for non-oil, it's 3.8, as against the revised targets of 3.7 and 4.3. So considerable underperformance is being recorded. The services sector, again, continues to record the highest growth at 5.5%, but this change was slower than the growth for 2021. Similarly, for agric, we saw a slowdown from 8.5 to 4.2 in 2022, while industrial sector recorded some marginal increase from a low growth of 0.4 percentage points. Official records from the first half of 2023 show some recovery from underperformance in 2022. Growth in Q1 2023 rebounded 4.2% compared to 3.0 in Q1. I was hoping that in 2023, normally we start low, then it picks up. So I was quite surprised to see a revision in the growth figures, 1.5%. Well, perhaps the austere measures are going to slow us down, or there may be other measures that will slow us down, the DDEP and many others. But I was expecting that we'll pick up gradually. Even if we don't pick up at all, at least we'll maintain some 3% throughout the period. Now let me touch on the fiscal situation. We are expecting a fiscal consolidation of 4.3% of GDP, that is for this year, but 9.2 in 2022. A deficit of 11.8% was recorded by end 2022. On cash basis was 10.7%, very, very high, against target of 4.3. And this really signaled a worsening position and our inability to successfully consolidate the fiscal position. And this was merely due to tightening global financing conditions, the loss of international capital markets, delay in the passage of the E-Levy. We saw the saga that happened in Parliament. Then fast depreciation of our cedi. All of this led to a huge fiscal deficit in 2022. And fiscal deficit was also driven by higher expenditure and lower revenue outturn compared to the targets that were set. Lower revenue outturn of 15.8% of GDP compared to what was programmed. We programmed 20%, and the revised figure was 16.4%. The growth in receipts of about 36.3%. Non-oil domestic revenue of 13.47% was still also lower than our peers. In our peers, you find 15, 16, 18%, but ours is slightly lower. But year-on-year revenue was broad-based, but grants marginally declined in 2022. So in a nutshell, we see that our total expenditure on commitment basis was 27% of GDP, above the mid-year budget target of 23.3% and a projected outturn of 25.8% of GDP. Expenditure on year was still above the revised targets, and expenditure performance was poor, as expenditure items above the mid-year targets were expected, except for capital expenditure, which is above the projected outturn. So we see that as we continue to record lower revenue compared to our targets, our expenditure is rather above our immediate targets. And again, that shows repercussions on our budget deficit, etc. So this again talks about our expenditure items, the internal, fiscal deficit of 10.7%, and was financed domestically 77.4, and only 14.7 in. Then also IMF SDR of 7.8. So the $600 million that came, this is where it went to finance our deficit. If you finance your deficit domestically by such a huge amount, it has repercussions for the private sector. It means you are crowding out the private sector. You're also creating lots of money in circulation. That partly explains the kind of inflation we are witnessing. Our debt GDP is 71.3%, as we are told, compared to 2021. And we've seen what caused the debt. Domestic debt was 44.7%, external debt 55.3%. So this is the first since 2029. Our fiscal strategy will continue to record the deficit compared to a fiscal deficit of 7.7 compared to the projected figure of 7.2 for 2022 and the provisional outturn of 10.8. I would move on swiftly to an area I want us to. So these are the medium-term targets that were set for us. The GDP rates, non-oil or GDP rate, fiscal, primary deficit, international reserves. We said we're going to have a 4 months import cover, and the macroeconomic targets for the fiscal year as well. So the medium-term targets as well as the fiscal year for 2023 targets are what we have in there. Now we had some supportive fiscal measures which I want us to revisit. One is the increase in standard VAT from 12.5% to 15%. I want us to look at this carefully because we'll have to look at how these new reforms are performed. We need to evaluate them. And then a review of the VAT registration threshold, reduction in E-Levy from 1.5 to 1% of transaction value, and removal of the daily threshold. We also saw withdrawal of discount on benchmark value on imports, and Guta was quite upset about this. The reintroduction of the public road tolls on selected roads, introduction of self-clearance system at the ports, introduction of VAT invoicing to cover all VAT taxpayers by 2024. Then the introduction of the 35 marginal income tax bracket, increase in 1% of concessional income tax rates to 5%. We modify the regime for taxing capital gains, introduction of a minimum chargeable income tax, unification of the provision on carry forward tax losses, and lastly, conversion of the National Fiscal Stabilization Levy to Growth and Sustainability Levy to cover all entities. Previously, it was the financial institutions, etc., that were paying. Now, all entities are going to pay this. So if you buy or you import, you see that your tax has changed. Some that were exempted are now paying this tax. Now, how have we fared in terms of all of this? You see personal income tax. So on the second column is a growth comparing the first half of 2023 with the first half of 2022. So it's a year-on-year comparison. You see that for personal income, it grew by 75%. And then if you compare with the program target, it means it's overachieved its target by 15.5. Okay? Then when you come to the National Fiscal Stabilization Levy, it also grew by 40-point-something%, but then it underperformed in terms of the target that was set. It is about half. We achieved half of what we planned to achieve. in the first half of the year. Now, note that in the previous slide, we said we're going to change this to growth and stabilization levy. But then, if you look at the mid-year budget review, that name still remains. It's still National Fiscal Stabilization Levy. The growth, and that thing hasn't changed, although we are still collecting the money and expanded the scope. VAT, we have increased VAT. In terms of growth, yes, almost 100% growth in VAT receipts. And then in terms of the target, we overachieve our target by 5.3%. So it tells you how the tax handles are performing in terms of growth as well as in terms of our targets that were set in the 2023 budget. Then E-Levy, E-Transaction Levy. Look at the growth rate, over 300% growth compared to the same period last year. However, it's underperformed. We achieved less than half of what we set to collect in terms of E-Levy in the first half of 2023. I think it is about time. That is why we said, ISSER, we take our time. We don't just go out and talk. We want to evaluate some of these tax handles to see how well we are performing. Then we can advise policy, we can inform policy as to how to enhance the tax collection, or if some are nuisance taxes, then we recommend that they are removed in order to create way for other forms of taxation. Okay, then import duty. You saw the removal of the benchmark values and all the things in the previous two slides. So how well have we performed in terms of import duty? In terms of growth in receipts from imports, we grew by 45%. But what about the targets that were set? We underperformed. That's why you see the negative figure over there. Property rate collection. Sadly, I must say, there was no figure for us to assess whether property rates are doing so well. There was nothing in there for us to assess. What they've done is that now myassembly.gov, if you go there, your properties have been captured. I don't know whether they have been to your house, but they will come to you, take your mobile phone number, take your Ghana card, and then link your property to your phone number so that they can then identify you and call and remind you. So I've been getting reminders. I haven't paid because I'm still trying to. Initially, I couldn't match the properties to the values they have given. So I called them back and we did that matching. I was able to tell that on a plot of land, I've been charged twice. So I've refused to pay. We have to resolve that before I pay. I'm telling you all of this. I'm telling you this to know that, yes, there's a lot of reforms to ensure that we pay property rates. So I was hoping to see some figures to see how well we are doing. Now, it's not assemblies that are collecting this. Now, it's GRA. So once that is done, somebody from GRA will call you and remind you that you have defaulted or you have not paid. Sadly, we don't have that figure there. So we've seen ISSER proceeds, energy recovery levy. They are all below target. We are underperformed. We have underperformed with ISSER proceeds, with energy debt recovery levy. That's why we see the IPPs threatening to shut down, because we are not collecting what we have earmarked to achieve. I highlighted pollution and sanitation levy because look at the growth, so small, and then look at the target we set, earmarked, minus 12%. We are not doing so well with that. Is that a nuisance tax? What should we do? By the way, don't link this to the former sanitation minister. There is no link between this. but it tells you clearly that some of the tax handles are doing well, others are not, and there's a need for review, and then we see our way clear. Revenue and expenditure, this is how it looks like. So it appears in terms of domestic revenue, non-tax revenue account for 69.2. Then non-tax or non-oil non-tax revenue is 8.5. Oil and gas gives us 16.3. Other revenue gives us 4.3. Grants 1.7. So it tells you these days we are not receiving enough grants, and we need to raise money a lot more domestically. Let's look at the expenditure side. Compensation, salaries and wages, etc. 23.8 of total expenditure. Goods and services 4.5. Interest payments accounts for 27.5%. But let's also bear in mind that because of the debt exchange, we have suspended interest payments, etc., to the external creditors. So as soon as we start paying them, this will change. And we don't know how much haircut or shaving they are prepared to take. But for now, there is some respite because we are not servicing some of our debts. Statutory payment 15.7, capital expenditure 13.9 of total expenditure, then other expenditure. So it tells you that if you look at interest for domestic, interest on domestic revenue, compensation to domestic revenue, statutory funds to domestic revenue, if you add these three, it means there's very little left from our total revenue for capital expenditure. That is why we continue to borrow to finance our roads and other forms of capital expenditure. So, so far, from January to June, I think I've spoken about the pace of revenue mobilization, the grants, and all of that. And we see our fiscal deficit of overall fiscal deficit of 1.3% of GDP against a deficit target of 4.4 for the first half and 7.7% of GDP for the whole of 2023. Now, fiscal deficit financed mainly from domestic sources. I think you saw that 54.1% and 45% from external sources. It has implications for deficit financing by Bank of Ghana. This is not sustainable if we front load everything or the majority on our central bank. That is not a feasible option. Our debt as of June 2023 was 78.8% of GDP. We also saw mixed credit rating from the ratings agencies due to the debt exchange program and all the things that are happening, the risk of vulnerability, the Russia-Ukraine war, escalation food and energy prices, all of this is affecting our fiscal situation. So the outlook, well, it looks some encouragement there. We've seen what the new tax handles are doing, but we need to look at it carefully. To what extent is it affecting industry? To what extent is it affecting the other critical sectors? Then on the monetary side, we've seen recorded positive signals in many of the indicators for monetary and financial sector development. I bet some of them have been very marginal. Inflation is trending downwards. Relatively stable exchange rate. We've made gains on the Ghana Stock Exchange, but there's been some substantial growth in total liquidity, M2+. Nominal interest rates and nearly all the interest-bearing assets compared to 2022. Interest rates have declined, and then partly attributed to the debt exchange program. However, we can see that we are recording negative or lower real returns. If you look at the interest rate on TB, for instance, if assuming it's 24-25%, and inflation is 45%, so you are earning negative returns on most of the assets, most of the investment. Fixed deposit, you might get 15%, with inflation of 45%. It means for most assets, we are recording or earning negative returns, and that is not good for investors. We saw in the first half of 2023 growth in money supply, 44.4% in 2022, and 16.2% related to the end period, mainly driven by domestic assets and then claims on government. Inflation, I think I've spoken about inflation, but the Bank of Ghana's medium-term target is not likely to be met. 8 plus or minus 2%, I think that target should be revised. Inflation rate of 42.5% as of June, and the government's target of 18.9% may also be missed because it's not likely we would achieve that. I think it's something around 30 to 40%. Given the relatively high food inflation, we think policies should be targeted at growing or enhancing the supply side. We need more supply side factors so that we can help reduce inflation in the economy. So these are some graphs showing you how inflation looks like. For combined inflation, we've seen the first set of bars, food and non-food and alcohol, non-food. So we have for January, February, March, April, May, and June. And we've seen some tapering off gradual, for non-food, gradual tapering off. And then for food, food is a challenge. It's still not coming down as expected. If you look at the June figures, food and non-food is still on the, food and alcohol is still on the rise. So we ought to fight inflation by tackling the food components aggressively. Interest rates, I think I have spoken about interest rate, the negative returns on our interest rate, but we've seen it declining. You can see the yield for last year compared to this year. You can see the two graphs merging, telling you that it's really coming down. Now, the one thing we should also look carefully is deficit financing. If Bank of Ghana is allowed to finance our deficits, it has implications for money supply. It means there will be more money in the system, chasing fewer goods, can lead to inflation, and can also have repercussions on the exchange rate. And therefore, there is a need to set limits on the financing of government. I try to understand how other countries have done it. And yes, as for the governor, in almost most countries, it is the government or the president who appoints the governor. Some are done through the Minister of Finance. There are processes they go through. But no matter what you do, it's the president who has to appoint the governor. He has the ultimate responsibility for doing so. But what they have done is that they set limits using the law to set limits as to how the central bank can finance government spending. We tried it. That's how come we had the fiscal responsibility law and all that. And then the Bank of Ghana's for the 5% of previous year's revenue. But as soon as we suffered from COVID, we scrapped that and they haven't gone back to reinstate that law. That is how come the central bank continues to engage in deficit financing now. So there's a need to set limit because an important facet of formal monetary policy is the independence of the central bank. And we need, Chile is one of the countries that has the tightest legal restrictions. No public expenditure may be financed directly or indirectly by credit from the central bank except under wartime conditions. Except under wartime conditions. Central Bank of Chile cannot finance government. And then the bank cannot purchase paper issued by the government, its agencies or enterprises. The bank cannot buy bonds and other things that we have been buying, including cocoa bills, etc. And in Germany, Switzerland, and Netherlands, the legislation sets strict limits on direct central bank credit to government, but allows government paper to be acquired in the course of open market operations. So we need to learn from some of these best practices so that our central bank can do what it does best. In terms of international trade, a lot happened. We saw a balance of payment deficit recorded about 3.6 billion compared to 510 million surplus in 2021. This was driven largely by deficits in the current account, as well as narrowed current account deficit, which was attributed to increases in trade surplus and remittances inflows. Exports grew, luckily for us, by 19.7%, while imports also grew by 7.3%, and resulting in a trade surplus of 2.8 billion. The export growth was due to increases in crude oil and gold exports. As usual, most of these are not processed, while exports of cocoa, beans, and products dropped by about 19%. Our total import bill grew by 7.3%, as I mentioned earlier. So in 2023, the first half, trade account recorded a surplus in the first half. The receipts reduced by 7.9% due to lower crude oil exports receipts. The effect was also alleviated by 14.9 and 14.2% year-on-year growth in earnings from cocoa beans. Unfortunately, non-traditional exports also recorded a 2.7% decline. I thought we should be doing better in that respect. Whereas merchandise imports also fell by 13.4%, which was as a result of reduction in both oil and non-oil imports. So balance of payment registered a lower deficit this year. And of course, it's much expected because we've gone through some challenges. And then also on the capital account, we recorded some lower net outflows. This was also due to lower amortization and private loan repayments during the debt exchange program and all that. So what should we do? We need to modify the structures and add value to our primary products. We are exporting too much raw commodities that always suffers volatility. Then domestic initiatives should also aim at increasing productivity, improving output in key sectors, and as well as the value chain and investable and invisible production of goods. That is the only way we can ensure a regular flow or stream of income when we face volatility. Then in terms of agric, we've seen some improvements, the planting for food and jobs. Here we have PFJ 2.0. We've moved from 1.0, now we are at PFJ 2.0. There's some progress being made because we've improved extension services to farmers. There's emphasis on women and youth by pronouncing or promoting exclusivity. However, the modalities for enlisting agro producers or agro dealers and qualifying them to distribute the PFJ has to be looked at. We're told there are some challenges there which affect the way they deliver their services. And they need to train district officers to ensure that they are able to deliver good services. Despite the progress, there are significant issues associated with the distribution of subsidized fertilizers. We know the issue about smuggling and all the problems that are associated with it. And then also issue about quality and the type. That's not of the quality that is desired. Then the volume of work involved. It puts farmers off the kind of paperwork involved to qualify and assess some of these initiatives. It's also quite a challenge. We ought to enhance some of the agro-processing industries under the One District 1F to ensure that the off-taker of farmers' produce is enhanced. Then we notice payback after harvest are yet to do so. Some farmers are not paying back, and that really affects the delivery of these services to farmers. In terms of industry, industry hasn't performed too well as expected. The sector contracted by 3.2% in the first quarter of 2023. All subsectors except electricity contracted in Q1 of 2023. So it is said that government is going to pass legislation to implement an enabling act provided for under mining and quarrying. But we saw mining and quarrying declining. We've seen manufacturing declining. We've seen water supply, sewage declining. Construction, of course, declining. Many banks, most banks will not lend to contractors because they also struggle to get paid by government, and it's affecting the books, the NPLs of banks. So banks are not willing to support contractors. That is also affecting, leading to the negative growth in industry. However, electricity grew by 3.5%. Again, with industry, the positive outcome for electricity could be largely driven by the regular tariff adjustment. We saw tariff adjustment, and actually under the IMF program, we are told there's going to be quarterly adjustment of revenue. So once revenue is adjusted, you can see that growth in numbers or in receipts also picking up. Poor performance of industry is a general indication of the extent to which that sector is susceptible to macroeconomic instability and uncertainty. COVID-19 has had its own shocks and to that sector, but macro instability will hit industry severely. So government will have to do more to achieve the growth projection of 1.4% for industry has been earmarked for 2023. The initial growth projection was 3.9, but it's been revised to 1.4. But even this, we think there has to be a lot has to be done to achieve it. We turn our attention to services, and we see quite a lot happening within that sector. Hotel industry, all services sector recorded significant growth, but some subsectors did not do so well. We've seen the highlighted areas: hotel industry, hotel and restaurant, no. ICT, yes, we've seen growth in ICT. Then education, we've seen improvement in education of about 10.2% in 2022. Some key highlights there for the hotel and restaurant recorded a negative growth in 2022, partly due to the low domestic tourism we've seen during the period. But then there was a presidential summit on tourism. And we think that in May 2023, we think that is going to help address that. Then the state-of-the-art Kwame Nkrumah Museum, I think that for me is really good. It's something that when foreigners come, when they are in a hurry, at least, and they come to Accra, they can quickly go there and have something to see. And I believe that's the next thing I want to see is the arts center, where it's constructed and put in a very decent manner. We were in Ethiopia and we saw not an art center, but somewhere they sell their traditional clothes and everything. A whole shed, big, tourists can come by. And I think it promotes tourism, it promotes made in Ghana goods or local goods, and we ought to do more of that. Agenda 111, some payments have been made as of May 2023, $189.34 million, and then currently there are 83 active project sites at various stages of construction. So on average, $2 million is being spent on each of the 89 sites on average. We don't know, we are not sure whether we can be able to finish all 89 or the 111 by 2024, but I think there's some progress being made there. Some of the challenges: cancellation of non-performing contractors, and then the site and land acquisition. Our problem with land. There's always litigation on land. So again, we've also seen some improvement in ICT services. improving the ease of business. The outlook for the services sector still looks good. It's expected to grow at 1.8% in 2023, 3% in 2024, 5% in 2025. So, but they need to patronize our travel and tourism sector. Home-based air carrier, we ought to think carefully. If you see the way Ethiopian Airways is being run, it's amazing. I mean, they are doing so beautiful well. It strikes, why we are not able to have a home-based air carrier where tourists can come in and go out as and when it's necessary. Okay, so on that note, let me draw conclusions. This media review mainly draws on the fiscal situation. The emphasis is on the fiscal performance, revenue, expenditure, and how it's going to be allocated, whether we are performing well, we are not performing well. So a review of the mid-year budget presents mixed outcomes. We've seen inflation decline from 50-something% to about 42.5%. We have seen exchange rate also show some stability. The rate of depreciation has been relatively. Budget deficit has been reduced. There's a decline in GDP growth forecast to 1.5% in 2023. Some of the revenue handles, the table I shared with you, show that it's improved, while a good have missed their half-year targets. So I think we have turned the first corner, but a few more to turn. I don't think, having seen this exchange rate budget deficit figures, we should be excited at this point. There are still a few more corners that we have to turn along the line, because inflation remains high within the continent. Inflation in Ghana still remains high, 45.2% is still high. Threats of exchange rate depreciation, given that the DDEP has enabled us to suspend interest payments for some point, up to some point, but the external loans that we have taken, we still have to pay them. As we speak, we don't know how much haircut the external creditors are willing to give to us. Once they come back to us, whatever is due has to be paid. So we ought to be careful in the way we celebrate. There's been some relative stability, but we are not out of the woods yet. The new taxes introduced in 2023 budget statement has to be critically monitored and evaluated. We have to do what we term evaluative thinking to see which ones are doing well, which ones are not, what are the problems, and how do we ensure that we rake in the needed revenue. Otherwise, we pile on new taxes every now and then, and it becomes a bit of a challenge for manufacturers and importers. So, evaluation of the tax reforms, personal income tax, as I showed earlier, has increased by 73.5% year on year. That is, if you compare the first half of 2023 with the first half of 2022, and above the program targets by 15.5%. So, in terms of personal income tax, I think we are doing very well. VAT receipts increased by 96.3% year on year and exceeded the target by 5.3%. Of course, in the first half, you collect less compared to the second half. Normally, taxes, you're able to do better in the second half. So hopefully, our VAT receipts would improve in the second half. But it's also a good sign that we are doing well. National Fiscal Stabilization Levy, which has now been converted into the Growth and Sustainability Levy. Although the name hasn't changed, if you look at Appendix 2B, it is still National Fiscal Stabilization Levy. It grew by 40.2%, but fell short of the target by 56.7%. Again, we have to revisit this carefully. I saw airport tax grow by 165%. Some of you who are not traveling, you are not paying this tax, so I'm sure you'll be fine. But at least there's a tax handle that is also well. Then our almighty E-Levy grew by 386.1% year on year. That is, if you compare the same period last year with this year, it has grown by 386.1%, but fell short of the program target by 53.6%. Again, our call to reduce the E-Levy rate is when it was reduced 1%, you've seen the growth in the figure. We believe if it's reduced further, 0.5 or 0.75%, and then we block the leakages through cash out. You see, last time I was telling one of the policy makers, and he was very much surprised. I said, there is this loophole called cash out. So if I want to buy, you just go to the vendor and say, cash out. The agent, telco agent, the Momo agent, you go there, then they will tell you, allow cash out. Then you send the money to them, then they cash it out and give it to you. Then you buy the thing, then you avoid E-Levy. So this is actually a major loophole that people are exploiting. Block this hole and reduce the rate, and I believe we will get in more revenue. I hope the agents will not be unhappy with me. Sadly, there's no data on property rates to assess its performance, but hopefully in the coming months, we will have data to assess whether property rate is doing as expected. Support for agric and industry is very key. There is a need for forward and backward linkages and the value addition to support the entire value chain. If we really want to fight inflation, then this is an area we ought to take critically. Issues about job losses, very critical. Under the IMF program, it brings fiscal stability, I must say, but with austerity measures which limits employment. There is the growth in employment, there's some limit on growth in employment. There are program reviews which will assess as our targets semi-annually. So every 6 months they will assess, and based on that, they will trigger disbursement. Program reviews include quantitative performance criteria. They also have indicative targets. They have monetary policy consultation clause. Then they have structural benchmarks. These assessments will trigger disbursements. And therefore, if they say don't increase employment by this margin, or don't increase expenditure by this margin, then you have to be careful. Otherwise, we'll lose the triggers, or lose that will come through. I think I've spoken at length about independence of the central bank. We have to respect the independence of the central bank. Bank of Ghana suffered a haircut during the debt exchange program. It was very significant, given that we were, I think the figure they quote was close to 50 billion, and that was quite significant. Looking at the total, we were able to raise under the debt exchange program, the first round. However, what brought us to this stage shouldn't happen again. Whatever we did that made us go for the IMF program, we can go for IMF program, but not under this condition, where we have to undertake haircut and all the challenges that is bringing to our economy. That shouldn't happen again. Deficit financing of 53.15 billion out of the total financing of 65.15 billion is quite a huge chunk to offload onto the central bank. So out of the total deficit financing, Bank of Ghana took 81.6%, and that is quite huge, quite significant, and we ought to avoid it. It is not sustainable. We need to set clear limits on government financing and enshrine this in our laws, our fiscal and monetary policies should work together. They should speak to each other. Otherwise, we are likely to face problems. If you continue increasing the monetary policy rate, meanwhile the fiscal side is not being adjusted, it's not behaving as expected, you are not in sync with each other, will not achieve the needed results. So my last two comments are that we are likely to witness lower growth prospects in 2023, but this will peak in 2024. The improvement in some of the tax handles and by extension revenue mobilization should be sustained, but with strict expenditure controls. It's one thing raising revenue, but more importantly, how you spend that money. Value for money expenditures, and then the review of the size of government. There were a lot of items listed that we're going to reduce government spending by 30%, we are going to wages by 30%. There were a lot. If you look at the 2023 budget, government said it was going to do a lot. Unfortunately, you cannot disentangle that in the expenditure lines that were provided. So to what extent are the expenditure cuts as stated in the 2023 budget statement yielding the needed results? Because we've seen a growth in expenditure. We're hoping that with all of this, yes, we have increased our revenue, but our expenditure will also be coming down so that we narrow the deficit and be able to ensure that we cut our coat according to the size of our cloth. But this is not happening, and therefore we need to revisit this carefully and provide more details on how we are reducing government spending. On that note, I will stop, and then the rest will be taken in the form of a discussion. Thank you very much.
We have turned the first corner, but a few more to turn. That's my key takeaway from Prof. Quarte's presentation, a very insightful presentation. And I'm sure everyone here has some key takeaways and a few questions to follow. At this point in time, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Matao. She's the head of the social division at ISSER. I would also like to acknowledge our online participants and our sponsors, Agricultural Development Bank and Stanbic Bank. Thank you very much for supporting us. We would like to take questions. We'll take a first round of questions for Prof. Quarte and other members of the Economics Division. Prof. Osakuto is also available. I'll take a first round, and then there'll be answers, and then we'll take a second round. If you can just raise your hand if you have a question, a microphone will be brought to you. Okay, I think I will start with the questions since no one is ready yet. So for me, we see that there's an increase in personal income tax. And my question is that while most of our employment is in the informal sector, so I'm thinking, are we not overburdening the people who are employed in the formal sector? And what can we do to bring in more of the informal sector employment so that we don't end up overburdening the few that are in the formal sector and have to keep paying taxes to sustain the rest of us?
Hello. I think you are very much right. Informal sector takes about 70 to 80% of our economy. And we tend, therefore, to burden the formal sector, because those are the areas you can identify, those are the people you can identify and easily tax. The use of the Ghana card is one sure way where we can gradually be able to know where people are, what they do, and then you can tax them. So with the Ghana card, if you need a tax clearance certificate, if you need a passport, they find a way of knowing whether you pay taxes or you don't pay taxes. But also, there are quite a lot of informal activities in the evenings. There's a night economy. To what extent do we find GRE targeting those areas? That is where you find most of the informal sector. I know during the day, they have what you call the tax stamp. So all the traders, and they pay some form of tax. But my worry is the night activity. My worry is the online businesses. My worry is those who do e-business, e-commerce. I'm told there's some, with Facebook, there's some agreement with Facebook. Is it Facebook or, yeah? So that if you advertise on Facebook, then government can find a way of taxing you. I think we should do more. But as Ghanaians, we should also be prepared to pay tax. It looks like not many people want to pay tax. I am told the number of people, taxpayers in Ashanti region, is so small. It's so surprising. It's so small. Why is that the case? But government should also be more accountable. Because if I pay tax and I don't know how the money is used, or the money is not used judiciously, I would be hesitant in paying taxes. In the UK, if you pay property rate, they will tell you this proportion goes to police, this proportion goes to ambulance, this goes to street lighting, and you see rubbish collection. Clearly, if you call the ambulance, it will come. Rubbish collection, they collect it regularly. Your lights are working. Street lights are working. The police would come if you call them. In our case, you pay property rate, then you have to pay for private refuse collection. You have to buy gravel if your road is not tarred, you have to be leveling, and you have to pay for so many things. If you call the police, they'll tell you to bring a vehicle to come and pick them. So it doesn't encourage people to pay taxes. And I think that is where we have to gradually move towards. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
So my name is McLean Kofi. I write for Daily Graphic. Prof, I'd like you to re-elaborate on some of your conclusions. For instance, we have turned the first corner, but few more to be turned. I'd like to know the indicators that has been turned and the ones that are yet to be turned. And then the next one is lower growth prospect in the 2023 budget. Lower growth prospect in 2023, but this will pick up in 2024. I'd like you to elaborate that for me. And then the nuisance taxes. Can you list some of them that falls under those categories? Thank you.
Can we take one or two more and then we can, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Jifa. I'm here at ISSER. So I'm concerned about the triple burden of some taxes. Just last Monday dawn, I didn't get any money in any ATM from Dawenya to Bombaria. So I have to buy fuel at dawn with my Momo Pay. It used not to be taxed. So that was the first time I was paying tax. The fuel is taxed. And then I was taxed again, E-Levy. And the same goes to cash out. If I have to cash out to buy something which is already taxed, what should be done? And I think that for me, the concern is about using the digital or E-Levy to make people pay triple or quadruple taxes in very insidious ways. And I don't know how we can we can solve this problem of the ease of using, because everybody is now on the internet, is using digital transaction to continue to exploit that, so that instead of people leaving cash, they will now have to go back to cash, because you are going to pay tax again and again and again, you know. That's my concern. I don't know how we can address this. Thanks.
Hello, Prof. My name is Beneza Sabote from JFM. My question has to do with the strict adherence of the Bank of Ghana rules. I want to find out from you, we have the Fiscal Responsibility Act, like you did mention, and then also the zero financing of the government. I don't know, is that not enough to be able to kind of government from over there? More laws? Don't we have too many laws already? I mean, do we have to enact another law to, I mean, get government off the Bank of Ghana, the central bank? Thank you.
Address this once, and then we, maybe let me start from the last speaker. Yes, the zero financing is something that came at the back of the IMF program. So ask yourself, after, if we're able to exit the IMF program, what happens? It means back to the usual. That is why I am calling for a long-term solution, something that will be enshrined. We used to have the fiscal responsibility law, yes, but we relaxed it because of COVID. And since then, it's not working. We are not applying it anymore. That's why I'm asking that we go back and reinstate that law, so that even if we are out of an IMF program, we'll still have something to restrict government. This is what is done in the countries I showed to you, Chile, Netherlands, etc. Germany. There's some legal framework guiding to what extent the central bank can finance government. Rules versus discretion. If you apply rule-based, works, discretion, people use their discretion every now and then, and sometimes to the advantage of the politician. That is why we need a rule to help us operate. Now to the question about turning the corner. It has become a very popular slogan. Yes, we have seen some improvements. Inflation was about 54 point something, came to 45 point something thereabout. Exchange rate has been a bit stable. Interest rates are coming down. But is that where we want to be? That's the question. Would you want inflation to be around 45%? Are we happy that inflation is at 45%? When you travel and meet your peers and tell them Ghana, our inflation is 45%, they laugh. If you tell them our interest rate is around 20, 30%, they laugh at you. Have we turned the corner? Yes, so for me, we have turned the first corner. But there are many corners we have to turn. Our interest rate has to come down to a acceptable level where businesses can borrow, invest, and be profitable so that it can employ our youth. Our inflation has to be low enough to make businesses be able to forecast. It has to be low enough for us to enjoy better livelihood. Otherwise, trade union and many others will continue to ask for more wages, and I don't think that's what we want to be. So yes, there's been some stability, but that is not optimal. That is not where we want to be. We want to be at a point where we all be comfortable to say that yes, our economy has reached the point where we can comfortably say yes, we have turned the corner. We have turned all the corners that we have to turn. But at the moment, I don't think we have reached the optimal. Lower growth, yes, that is the projection in the budget statement, that 2023 is going to be 1.5%, but in 2024, it's going to pick up. But I strongly believe we may do better than the 1.5. I strongly have the hope that, as the economists say, all things being equal, we are likely to achieve something higher than 1.5%. Then the nuisance taxes. We have seen COVID-19 levy. I think that thing was instituted to help us fight COVID-19. I don't think we are still fighting COVID. Of course, we borrowed to fight COVID, so maybe we are using this proceeds to pay. But I don't think we are fighting COVID. So we have to relook at some of these taxes. We call it nuisance if it's not yielding enough revenue. It becomes nuisance because the cost of collecting those taxes sometimes may far outweigh the revenue you derive. So it's better you scrap it and rather introduce something that will yield a better result. Triple, yeah. Well, I think to some extent you are right. You pay tax on the goods you buy, and there's E-Levy. But it's a handle to raise revenue. We've reached a critical point where our revenue GDP ratio is so low. So government is finding ways by which it can tax some economic activity. We started with e-commerce, but I think, with E-Levy, that is very narrow. It should be e-commerce. I think the initial idea was e-commerce. So E-Levy and online transactions, online businesses. If you are able to rope in all of this, the rate will be so low that even when you are paying, you will not feel it. Mind you, our Visa cards that we use, we pay to the card holders. We pay even the exchange rate they use and all that. There are some payments we make. It doesn't go to government, it goes to the private companies. So the government finds a way of getting revenue from you because it's providing a platform, convenience. That is fine. My problem with E-Levy is that the rate for me is still punitive. If we make it 0.5 and you're paying, it's safer. Criminals will not follow you because you are carrying cash. You don't have to walk to a certain place to pay. It is very convenient to use. So it is something that we have to live with, except that we do it in such a way that the rate is not punitive. Thank you. I think there are authors here who will have to speak. Otherwise, I'll call them.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Winston Taki of Metro TV. First of all, we know habitually, anytime it's getting to an election year, the case of over-expenditure, our public debt tends to increase. This time around, we've seen the projections being made by the finance minister. Will we really meet those targets before the end of the year? We know that most road constructions tend to happen in the fourth quarter of the year, where most promises by political parties tends to be realized. So are we to be cautious this time around, considering the looks in our books as a country in the face of ratings from agencies and bilateral partners? Thank you.
Professor Fosu, I think you should answer that question.
Thank you, Director. It's a political environment game. The framework is such that politicians want to get reelected, right? So it's rational for them to spend. So the only way we can mitigate that is to ensure that we increase executive constraint to ensure that they cannot spend. Indeed, I was looking at some numbers we were talking, and the highest expenditure actually happened in 2020. And then we have all these reverberations thereafter. And it turns out that they have an item called other cash payments. Other cash payments. And that grew about over 500%. 10 billion cities, as I understand it. The question is, what is in there? This is pre-election, right? Around that period, the election period. What is in there? And that's the kind of thing that we need to diagnose and ensure that that doesn't happen again. And that, again, will call for having greater executive constraint. So that is my suggestion. Thank you.
Exactly the point. As for politicians, I mean, who would hold a stick and allow a dog to bite him or her? Elections, do or die, it's very competitive. If I don't spend, I'll lose elections. You're holding a stick, a dog is coming to bite you, and you say, I've been told not to hit a dog, so I won't hit. But where there are rules, where you strengthen the executive arm, you ensure that there are rules that guide spending, then that will not happen. I recall vividly in 2016, we were under an IMF program. You remember? Yes, and we had elections. About September, October, I was part of a cabinet, I went to present the paper at cabinet. We saw the figures. Deficit was around 5% of GDP, 5%. So, bingo. By December, January, we were hitting 11% under an IMF program. So, I cannot assure you that we will respect that given what we have seen in the past. But I'm hoping that we have learned our bitter lesson. Now we had a debt exchange program, which was very, very bitter, which was very, very difficult. It brought us a lot of pain. I hope and believe that we have learned our bitter lessons and will not repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you.
Okay. I think with regards to the property rate issue, Prof. Kote, you raised, practically, when you look at countries like Brazil and most developing countries, with regards to the property rates, what they've done is that at the district assembly level, when they are budgeting, they ensure that the executives will have a percentage, let's say 30%, and then the citizenry will have like 70%, decide on what they will do at the district assembly level. So throughout the year, they are aware that this is the amount the assembly has generated for budget, and this is the percentage the executives will decide on, and this is the percentage that the citizens are depending on. So based on that, they can monitor the projects that are going on in their jurisdiction. So I think that's a practical way of going, so that we will ensure that people will have the incentive of paying the property rates. My main question has to deal with the rent tax. I think for a number of years we were talking about the rent tax as a handle of revenue generation, but very little has been said with regards to that. So I don't know if there is information that you can throw more light on, so that we will know that based on the performance of GRA on rent tax, this is how they perform. So we roll it on property rates for them to assist to, they will be able to perform better. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Prof, you've indicated that at the macroeconomic level, we are witnessing some relative stability to the ordinary Ghanaian, as we refer to them. The guy who would want to wash the windscreen of someone to be able to get 1 CD to buy cocoa the next day. How do we ensure that these macroeconomic improvements are reflecting in the lives of the 850,000 Ghanaians who have been pushed into poverty as a result of inflation? Thank you. My name is Francis Into. I work with the Ghanaian News Agency.
Okay, so let me attempt to respond to. You see, the property rate, there are several examples, just like you mentioned the case of Brazil. In our case, we are now building the database So it's good, let's build a database. Then the next step will be enforcement. Because over here, we don't enforce. Out there, if you default, sometimes they slap a penalty. If you default, you can be taken to court. I remember I left my property in the UK in the care of my brother-in-law, and he defaulted in paying property rate. I don't know how they managed. They got my email address and wrote to me in Ghana. Apparently, they have taken me to court. So I had to quickly mobilize money and go and settle it. You see, that is systems that work. Somebody is working. They didn't have my email, but they went online. They had their name. So they went online looking for me and got my email address. Over here, ask yourself, if you don't pay, sometimes you accumulate 2-3 years, no penalty, you pay the same amount. They hardly charge you any penalty. You pay the same amount. So we need to enforce some of this. Rent tax, yes, if you rent a property, I think you pay 15% or so. And there's also capital gain. When you sell a property, you pay 20%. But how many landlords' properties have been captured? Ask yourself, how many properties have been captured? How many landlords voluntarily will go to the assembly and say, I'm paying? So yes, the incentive you mentioned, that people know that they also benefit if they pay, is one way. But the other way is to capture, know where properties are, who owns them, how much is being rented out for, and then the enforcement in case you default. Macro stability, it will by all means reflect in your pocket. We have seen some marginal improvement. That is why when you go to the pumps, we're buying diesel at 23 cedis, 23 point something. Now it's come down. Can you imagine if it was still going up? How much you pay for petrol, how much you pay for other things, food would also go up. So macro stability, sometimes we say, oh, we don't eat these figures. We don't eat inflation. You eat inflation. You eat macro stability. When prices are stable, you're able to buy more. Your income can afford more things for you. When prices go up, you get less. The purchasing power of your money declines. So yes, we need more macro stability, but that should go hand in hand in creating the enabling environment for the private sector to flourish so that we can employ more people. Government alone cannot do it. We need a private sector to employ more people, pay better incomes. And once our real incomes are positive, they are good, then we'll feel it in our pocket. So yes, macro stability can translate into better livelihood for the rich and the poor. And those who are vulnerable and excluded, the LEAP program, if it's well managed, is one of the sure ways by which we can reach the poor, the vulnerable, and the excluded.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, so we have 2 more questions. Okay. Professor Akoto.
The writer wants me to speak. Yeah, maybe what I can add is...
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Abubakar Siddiq Ahmed from Radio Universe. Prof, you talked about inflation, and frankly speaking, if you look at the macroeconomic indicators since the beginning of the Fourth Republic, this has been a problem with other macroeconomic indicators. Prior to the Fourth Republican period, of course, we had military dictatorship. But we went to the IMF 17 good times, whether in a democracy or in a military dictatorship or pseudo-democratic period. Now my question is, what is it that makes it possible for our neighboring countries as we speak with an inflation of about 42.5%. And the lowest, whether it is Togo, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Liberia, about 5%, up to about 9%. What are we doing wrong? And how do we think alternatively to resolve this problem? That is my first question. My second question is about the taxation. We talked about, or we started with a certain principle or philosophy of moving from taxation to production. And we all thought that that was a good idea because we could then produce, export, and be able to maybe balance our books, move away from deficit financing. I'm not an economist. Can you help us? Were we performing as we thought of prior to the COVID-19 period? And post-COVID-19 period, are we still, what do you call it, on track? Thank you very much.
Writer says I should attempt. And my answer will be that this is beyond media review, right? These are sort of questions. What are we doing wrong? I think the countries are different, right? And this particular issue we have now, the way it will impact your system will depend on how resilient, right, your system is and how exposed you are to the global market. I've actually not studied the sub-countries' economies, but some of them are also going through debt restructuring issues, looking for money from IMF and the rest. So sometimes the generalization really doesn't help. We need to go a bit deep. Why are they having sort of coup d'etats, and why are some countries not having coup d'etats? Systems are different, but the answer is really how resilient you are. I mean, in response to your exposure to the global market. Perhaps Ghana is overly exposed to the global market, and any shock from there, you tend to have your share of the shocks. The issue is, how do you recover? How do you recover? The advanced countries are very resilient. They have the adaptive capacities, so the recovery is faster. But in our case, once the production base is weak, you tend to have some time before you can recover from such issues. That is are we doing something wrong, right? The other one I wanted to add is to the issue on the vulnerables. I think we have to really strengthen our social protection systems, because it comes back to how ready you are to help those who will be unable to really be active in the economic situation. No matter what you do, you have, especially for middle-income countries, you have people who will be off the economic growth. And you need to have a very strong social protection system to carry them along. School feeding, LEAP, as the director said, labor-intensive public works. There are quite a lot that we need to look at. Regular payment of the benefits to those who are vulnerable and those who are completely not in a position to participate actively in the economic market. I think that should be it for now.
You know, I think I like your point about generalization. Sometimes the inflation figures I see across the sub-region really bothers me. I don't know whether they are true inflation figures or not. I don't have the data. But I see some countries in Africa recording lower inflation figures than Britain, than US. And I really wonder whether they are true, whether they really measure them properly. Just like COVID, when COVID struck, some countries were recording very low COVID figures, where they were dying in numbers. So sometimes be careful when you are generalizing, because you may not be reflecting what is truly happening in some of those countries. If you go and live there, then they will tell you, sometimes we are even better off if you go to some of those countries. We are far, far better off than them. So there's a lot of room for improvement. I think our leaders, our governments have opportunity to make life better for us. They haven't done as much as we expected. But it doesn't mean we are the worst in the continent. Sometimes we hear some of these sayings and it's quite disturbing. Others come and they are so happy, so praiseworthy of what we have. So let's be careful. If we don't have the evidence, let's not generalize. Yes, up to 2029, the figures show that we were doing well. Sorry, 2019, the figures showed we were doing well. After 2019, things started getting out of hand. And for me, I think we borrowed beyond limit. If you ask me what we did wrong, we borrowed irresponsibly, because there is a debt GDP ratio. There's a threshold. And IMF report from 2014 kept warning us not to borrow. We are hitting the threshold. We are hitting the threshold. And we refused to listen. And this is where we are. So if there's anything at all that we did wrong compared to our neighbors, it is our debt GDP. We borrowed beyond limit. That, for me, is where we went wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take our last round of questions. I see 3 hands up, so we take that and then we are done.
Thank you. If you allow me to add to what my HOD and director have said, and that fundamental question that was asked by the Radio Universe reporter. I think the World Bank has released a report recently on Ghana, which I think is quite remarkable if we should read it. And I would like to read a statement. They said, theoretically, monetary inflation could benefit the poor if inflation comes from expansionary monetary policy. So basically, if money supply from the central bank is what is causing inflation, it could actually benefit the poor to the extent that it increases demand, and that demand could lead to production expansion and employment. So the unemployed people could be employed. But the inflation in Ghana is not a monetary one. And I think that's something that we need to agree in this room. The World Bank says that the inflation in Ghana is not a demand pull inflation, it's a cost push inflation. It's basically because Ghana, unlike other countries, and I'm from the Western region, so Cote d'Ivoire is a very typical example. I just came from the village last week. I bought rice from Cote d'Ivoire. A 25-kilo bag of rice is about 300 Ghana cedi. You will get the same quality of rice, about 500, if you bought it in Accra from the ones that are imported from Vietnam. Because the prices in Ghana are high. And in the environment of high prices, we increase government fiscal policy is neutral. Basically, we have avoided the days of price control. We have taken away subsidies on utilities, electricity, fuel, and then we add taxes in the same environment. Totally awkward. In other countries, when inflation is even external, and it's coming from the global market. Fiscal policies absorb. If you will not control prices, essential prices like food and gas and utility and petrol, you don't add taxes on them in that environment. So that's what we were doing. In the environment where we say COVID is happening and Ukraine war, you saw introduction of taxes, not only E-Levy, you saw sitting down and allowing petrol prices to go, adding to the gas prices and everything. And at the same time, the central bank raising the policy rate from about 14.5% to now almost 30. This is not we were taught in economics. This basically, so that is what was happening. It was not happening in other countries. There's no other country you mentioned that allowed those things to happen. The other source of inflation is mainly food. We have failed in agriculture. So when you are importing onion from your neighboring countries, importing tomatoes from other countries, it's because agric is failed. And therefore, food inflation is a key issue to deal with. That is one of the problems that we're having. From the trade side, it's a mainly balance of payment problem. If you ask, why did Ghana go into crisis? Mainly, as the writer said, is from the balance of payment issue. What are the causes of the balance of payment? Over borrowing, not mainly the domestic borrowing. The domestic debt exchange is totally needless because what caused our crisis is not deficit financing, mainly. It's not borrowing from the central bank. It's mainly because of the borrowing from the external balance. If you look at external borrowing, it shot up from 2017 to the extent that we could not finance that. And you need exchange rate, dollars, to finance it. And once you could not get enough dollars because you are exporting less, then you have a balance of payment constraint. And then you need to go to IMF, or you need to restructure your external debt. And they say if you're going to do that, you must also restructure your domestic debt. And that's basically where we are now. So how do we resolve this? Again, it's from trade. For me, it's from trade. We need to now ramp up agriculture, ramp up industrialization, ramp up our export, so that the export revenues is what we will need rather than borrowing externally, which we are not able to service. So there are a number of things that were going on in Ghana that were not going on in those other countries. As to whether the inflation figures are right or not, I am not sure, because even the Ghana inflation also, I was reading this morning, I think, I saw a paper, I think, Baumia in 2016 or so, wrote and criticized the inflation figures in Ghana, questionable, and even the Bank of Ghana. So I think there are questions around the statistics everywhere, but it's also quite clear to me as I travel across the sub-region, even in Nigeria. I was in Nigeria about a month ago. Prices until Tinubu came, fuel prices and things were lower. Food prices lower in Nigeria. And no bank, central bank in the sub-region has their policy rate above 25%. None of them. So, and the policy rate is, it feeds into inflation, even though it's supposed to fight inflation. So it raises the cost of borrowing. And if cost of borrowing is high, then of course that's also going back into the same problem. So we have a lot of issues that we need to deal with, which I think we have not sat down to look at.
Thank you, Prof. Aka. Here.
Thank you very much, Prof. My name is Daniel. I'm a student with ISSER. I think when Prof was making the presentation, he made mention of the fact that when we look at the expenditure component, compensations and salaries tend to be the maximum component of it. And then in your conclusion part, you indicated that there should be a review of the size of government. Some months ago, we had the former President Mahama also make similar call for government to reduce its size. And according to him, if we give him the opportunity again, he's going to reduce the government size to a maximum of 60. Professor Bobkin some months ago also indicated that Ghana should run on a size of 40 ministers. In your own opinion, what do you think should be the size of government, taking into consideration the current economic situation? And again, with the country that you indicated, with the measures they put in place to ensure that the central bank do not finance the deficit, and you are calling for the same measures to be adopted in this country, do you not think that probably it's not just about the laws that permit or the kind of do not allow the central government to finance the deficit, but there should be other institutional measures that should accompany the laws that we make. Because my question would be, if we should adopt the measures adopted by Chile, where the central government do not finance the deficit, except in war times, then what do you think would be the political and the economic implications of not allowing the Central Bank of Ghana to finance the deficit that we have in the country? Thank you very much. And lastly, if I'm allowed, with the irresponsible borrowing and the government expenditure, do you also think that the Parliament of Ghana has failed in its duty of acting as a watchdog on government expenditures? Thank you.
Sorry. I was finding the debate quite exciting, so I wanted to join it. Just to support the director and my colleague here, first, it has to be understood that Ghana has outperformed many of these countries since the early 1980s in terms of growth rate. Outperformed much more. So when we are comparing Ghana to these other countries, on the growth side, there's no doubt that Ghana has done very well. And has also transformed that growth into poverty reduction, much more than many of these countries have. So let's not confuse the evidence. Two, it is true that inflation has been higher in Ghana than other countries, generally speaking. But since 2016, the inflation rate has been coming down quite tremendously. So much so that around 2018, 2019, and so on, inflation in Ghana was actually lower, not higher, lower than most African countries. It wasn't until 2020 that we overspent. Most of the inflation, if you look at the deficit, you also find the deficit much higher in Ghana than other countries. But the deficit was coming down, and that was probably responsible for the lower inflation until 2020. 2020 is the benchmark. We have to go back and try to interrogate the data to find out how come Ghana spent so much in 2020. Once we resolve that issue, then there's no issue left. So yes, inflation has been a problem, generally speaking, but Ghana did very well lowering inflation. But something happened in 2020 that jacked up the fiscal deficit, mostly from spending, not from revenue, right? And as a result, Ghana is in this situation. So if you can go back and resolve the issue, Ghana can bounce back. Thank you very much.
I think I would add a brief point on the productive sectors. And it will sadden us to know that each year when we have a demand of 350 tons of poultry, our installed capacity to produce poultry is 25,000 tons. And currently we are only operating 15,000 tons. So even if tomorrow we were to stop importing poultry products, we cannot supply. I can go on and on, plantain, cocoyam. The only thing we do not have a problem with is cassava. Every other food product we are importing. So how do we do something about the agricultural sector? I think one of the mistakes I believe we are doing is the overemphasis on the smallholder farmer. Our attention and subsidies is all targeted towards the smallholder farmer. I believe we can look at the mid-range, and this morning I understand that there are just about a little below 1,000 large-scale farmers in Ghana. You cannot feed yourselves if that is the situation. So we should target, instead of spending our subsidies on 1 million farmers, giving them fertilizers, which we cannot even account for, because in some cases they don't pay back. We should pay attention to the medium-range farmers, support them to enlarge the production, and then coordinate the processing. But if we are targeting 2 million farmers, I think our actions, we may not be able to track it, and we cannot make progress. So let's look at the agricultural sector and reform it. And I think that can help us. If you cannot produce to feed yourselves, currently cereals was the main driver of our food inflation, 67%. You can't buy maize, you cannot buy rice. So we need to look at that sector. I think we've done something about it in the last 5 years. But the thing is, still, all that we want to eat, we cannot find it here. So we need to do something about that.
Thank you, Dr. J. Holmes. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to end this. It's been very interesting. Okay, Prof. Potter wants to address.
Yes, there was a question about the laws and institutional measures. Yes, the laws would only work if the institutions also work. So that is how come Parliament, for instance, if you institute those laws, there's a cap on how much deputy financing Bank of Ghana can undertake. If there has to be any budget, and we know the budgets are sent to Parliament for approval, so any spending will certainly have to be approved by Parliament. So the institutions have to work to ensure that whatever limits we set works. Otherwise, just having a law will not achieve the needed objective. Has Parliament failed? That one will get a student to undertake a PhD thesis, write a PhD thesis on that to assess our Parliament to see whether they have failed or not. But I think in as much as they are helping us, there is still a lot of room for improvement. I think sometimes the partisan nature of Parliament affects the delivery of the services they provide for us. And Charles, your point about inflation is very much well noted. I think it's very much true. It's more of a supply side factors, than the demand side. But unfortunately, we are using demand side policies as well, and that sometimes aggravates the problem. When there is shortage of food, when we are not having enough supply and prices are going up, inflation is going up, and you increase the policy rate, it's also going to feed into businesses' ability to borrow, to produce. So we have to look at the whole thing. That's why in my presentation I said both the fiscal and monetary should work together. They have to synchronize their policies. Otherwise, we might be at variance or might be fighting each other. And Andy's point about focusing on the small-scale farmers at the expense of the large-scale farmers is very much true. Fertilizer subsidy. It's all about small-scale farmers. Sometimes they are not able to buy. People buy and smuggle. People buy and resell to them. And, we need to look at the value chain, look at large-scale farmers who then pull the small-scale farmers along. But if we focus on the small-scale farmer who produces mainly, hand to mouth, basically, the average land size or food crop size is 2 acres. How much would you make from 2 acres? So we need to look at more of that and really address our challenges. We ought to borrow responsibly going forward. I think on that note, I would pause for us to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Porty.
There are some online participants.
Yes.
Do we have any question from them?
No, we don't.
No, thank you.
I know people have some more questions, but I'm sorry. There's one. V. Can you please read it out for us?
Hello. Prof, how do we leverage against high import duties so that other countries can trade via our ports to increase revenue? It looks like import sector inflation is neglected.
I think it's all been taxation. We are overtaxing. Initially, I bought into the idea moving from taxation to production. It makes a lot of sense. When you promote production, people produce more, they all pay tax, you know, and you get your tax revenue. But now it's like it's not working. That from taxation to production thing is not working. And therefore, because the other factors that affect production, it's not just taxation, your cost of doing business, the enabling factors and all that. So we are rather taxing more and taxing the same people. If we're able to broaden the tax base, then this over-reliance on import duties and will reduce. I'm told that container volumes at the port are slowed down. Yes, those from Burkina, etc., who we use as, will reroute their traffic. So as a policy maker, you need to evaluate. See, that is why evaluation is very important. Any policy you put in place, you need to quickly evaluate and see whether it's yielding the needed results. Why are people not using our ports? Do we have too many taxes? And even the service providers, apart from government taxation, I'm told port handling charges and all have all gone up. So it makes it difficult for importers to use our port. It is about time we go back and revisit this and make sure we are doing the right things. Otherwise, what we continue to do would hurt production, would hurt imports. We depend so much on imported commodities for production, for consumption. And if we are not careful, the inflation rate we are seeing will never come down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gotti. And sorry, but we have to end. Thank you all for participating in this program today. I would like to thank the Director of ISSER, Prof. Gotti, for his insightful presentation. I would also want to say thank you to the senior members of ISSER, the staff of ISSER, our students. Thank you so much for being here. I would also want to say thank you to the members of the university community and our friends in the media. We are very grateful that you responded to our call to be here today. We are also very, very grateful to our online participants. We couldn't have done this without you. And our sponsors, ADB and Stambik, you are always with us, and we can't say thank you enough. And to all others who I might not have mentioned by name, we are still very, very, very grateful for your participation today. Thanks for making this a very interesting, insightful, and educative event. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see you here next year and with more questions and more insights. Thank you. Have a good day. Oh, next month, in September, we are having a program. So we would like to see everybody here again. Thank you. So for being, today I've actually really enjoyed today, I must say, and would like to give ourselves a hand of applause for being very good participants. Yes, so thank you so much. So there'll be refreshments. So don't be in a hurry to leave. Network, get to know someone that you don't know. And then there'll also be a few interviews. So senior staff and director of ISSER, please be around. Thank you so much.